Hello, everyone. Welcome to Talking Logistics, where we have conversations with thought leaders and newsmakers in the supply chain logistics industry. And it's my great pleasure to welcome to today's program Troy Ryley, who is Managing Director of Transplace Mexico. And today we're going to talk about the growing importance of U.S.-Mexico trade. This is a topic that's getting a lot of buzz in the industry today, certainly with onshoring, with a lot of companies moving their operations from Asia to the United States and to Mexico. So again, a lot of things that a lot of companies are focusing on this, including shippers, retailers, manufacturers, as well as 3PLs. And Troy is certainly an expert in this area, and certainly looking forward to his comments and his perspective in this whole area. Just a reminder, our goal here at Talking Logistics is to make this a interactive conversation. So as we're going through our conversation here, if you've got a question or a comment for Troy, you can go ahead and submit that via the submit a question button or the live chat feature, and I'll go ahead and weave that into the conversation. Just a reminder that if you are joining us as a visitor, you will have to register first before you can ask a question. So with that, Troy, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Adrian. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today.
So, Troy, before we kind of dive into the topic, why don't I always like to ask my guests how they got involved, with supply chain logistics. So why don't you tell us a little bit briefly about your career path, how and why you got involved with the industry, and kind of what your current role and responsibilities are there at Transplace Mexico.
Thank you very much. Well, first off, I think I always knew I wanted a career in international business. I had a father that was always very international. I grew up actually in Taipei, Taiwan. I lived there for 6 years. My father then later worked for the State Department, so he was in Kenya and Uganda, Ghana, Africa, El Salvador. And, I think these things just kind of get in your blood after time. So I got into an international business school called Thunderbird in Arizona and received my master's in international business just about the time when NAFTA was being launched. So I was sent to Mexico in the early 90s by my first employer, Distribution Services Limited, known at that time as DSL. And I was actually going to go down and work with Walmart as they set up their first stores in Mexico. So I lived in Mexico for over 12 years. I spent a little bit of time in Central and South America also with another company, but my predominant roles were with companies such as Maersk Logistics, now Damco, which I was the general manager, and I was the country manager for a company called Expeditors International for Mexico. 7 years ago, I left Expeditors to create a southern border solution for Transplace, and my current title right now is Managing Director for Transplace Mexico.
Great. It sounds like you've had a lot of experience not only in the logistics industry, but there in Mexico as well. All right, so let's kind of get into the topic. When you think about U.S. Mexico trade, you can think of it within the broader context of NAFTA, and we're kind of celebrating the 20th anniversary since NAFTA was ratified. So how has trade between the U.S. and Mexico changed from 1994 to today?
That's a great question. I actually arrived in Mexico before NAFTA had been finalized. So that was the early 90s. A lot of buzz was going on in the country about the agreement and what it would do for Mexico. In fact, it was a very exciting time for a lot of people I knew from graduate school that had been hired by companies like PepsiCo, Banco Mero, which is a big bank in the region, Sabritas, which is Frito-Lay in Mexico, as the companies were betting on economic growth and the potential of business between the two countries. So I always say kind of the pinnacle of what happened in the market. I always say that Walmart kind of led the way. It was one of the first pioneers, in my opinion. They affiliated and partnered with a group called CIFRA and later on ended up purchasing the company. But I think the important key for Walmart's entry was it really did establish a very high standard, raising the bar for competition in Mexico. Companies like Comercial Mexicana, Gigantes, Soriana, they're all retail chains in the Mexican marketplace. they all had to start competing at a much higher level than they had been accustomed to competing. Some survived, some didn't. Gigante, for example, no longer exists. But it opened the door for U.S. companies to expand south of the border, and it became much easier for U.S. companies to set up and do business in Mexico during this time frame. As you know very well over this 20-year period, in 1993 we did about 40 billion in U.S. exports into Mexico. In U.S. imports, we were doing about 42 billion. Now in 2012, U.S. exports are roughly 1.48 trillion. And U.S. imports are roughly 2.12 trillion. So in my mind, it was absolutely a success and continues to be a great success between the two countries.
Yeah, certainly a lot when you look at those numbers you just, cited in terms of the growth in both exports and imports, south of the border over the last 20 years, it has been pretty impressive. I mean, you look at the month-to-month data that comes out from the, Bureau of Transportation Statistics, we see that, even through the recession, obviously there was some down points there, but, overall the trade between the two countries remained relatively strong, despite, some of the economic conditions. It seems like we've kind of come full circle, with Mexico. I think when you look back into the 90s, a lot of companies, as you reference, were, setting up operations in Mexico and sourcing from Mexico. And then kind of China and Asia kind of became the focus for a lot of retailers, a lot of manufacturers, and they shifted the operations over there to Asia. And now we're kind of, looking back at Mexico, right? And like I mentioned in my opening comments with, reshoring and near sourcing and things like that. So Mexico is kind of back in the spotlight, it's the way I see it. So what is it about Mexico that makes it, an attractive trading partner today?
Well, I think you brought in Asia, which was the buzzword for many years, and it still is the buzzword in many respects. I think, especially because of the recession, Asia has become a little bit more unpredictable and costly for many reasons. But we've seen, for example, instability in ocean freight costs and issues with LA ports in past years. Chinese labor, which everyone perceives as some of the cheapest in the world, isn't as cheap, especially as you have to go further in country, off the coastal regions, to try to find cheaper and cheaper labor as the coastal regions begin to develop economically and have more of a middle class. The U.S. economic recession made companies decrease inventories, which increased their need for speed to market and shorter cash-to-cash cycles. So unfortunately, China and most of Asia has a very long lead time, which makes forecasting even more difficult. So in addition to this, China has a very old population. It's one of the fastest aging populations in the world. And aging populations are more oriented towards services than they are consumption of goods. So it's not a consumer market per se as much as some other countries in the world. Mexico, on the other side, on the other hand, did a great job simplifying doing business. So they've created a Maquila program that's been very successful. It allows you to bring material in tax-free, allows you to transform it, and then re-export it, only paying tax on the value added. There are roughly 4,000 maquilas operating in Mexico today. That being said, and I'm not going to hit on this today, some of the laws in reference to maquilas are changing, although it's still a great program for companies that are doing business in between the two countries. So Mexico has a very young population. They're high into consumption. They are as I said before, the older populations tend to consume services where the younger populations consume products. In Mexico, you've seen a big increase in the consumption of U.S. and foreign goods. So energy is another important element. Most industrial countries convert either steel or plastic to products. You need energy in order to do this conversion. Luckily for Mexico, the U.S. has a surplus of natural gas. It's a cheap energy source that helps Mexico continue to be competitive. And also, obviously, the last few items, economic stability, the peso, there hasn't been devaluation since the 90s. Mexico's built up substantial reserves. Currency is stable and inflation is under control. So, but I think the most important factor is people want things quicker, faster, more efficiently, and it's hard to beat a country that's 24 to 72 hours away from most points in the United States. Creates a very different dynamic.
No, I agree. I mean, I think that last point you brought up, particularly with, everything going on right now with, on the one hand, you're seeing delivery times going from, 2 day, 3 day to, a lot of retailers trying to get into same day delivery. And what's that doing to, just the push to try to, have products in stock, replenish quicker, so on and so forth. I think that's a great point in terms of some of the driving, forces there. I hadn't thought about kind of the aging population, or comparing kind of the demographics of China with Mexico. I think that's interesting. A lot of people always look at China, obviously, because of just the sheer number of people that live there as a consumer market. But there is that, as you noted, there is that kind of, when you peel back the onion a little bit, kind of looking at the age differences, and kind of, how it's not just about the numbers, but it's also about the age of the population, what that does from a consumer, perspective, in terms of making it an attractive market. So let's focus now on transportation and logistics. What are the main gateways, for cross-border trade between the U.S. and Mexico, and what differences are there between them?
Well, Laredo has now won the distinction as being the fifth largest port in the United States. What makes this even more impressive, really, is that the trade across the Laredo border is really with one country. When we look at Los Angeles or New York, New Jersey, they're servicing entire regions of Asia and Europe. So that's a pretty impressive statistic in the U.S. Market. So Laredo is the main gateway between Mexico and U.S. for over, uh, uh, and today, I'm sorry, they have about 13 to 14,000 shipments crossing a day. Now I need to qualify that. Some of those are LTL shipments. They're not all full truckloads, but the merchandise handled is roughly 64 billion in U.S. imports and about 57 billion in exports last year. So why is Laredo so important? It's the shortest entry port to the largest markets, which are Mexico City and Monterrey. If you think of Mexico, it's really only about 2.5 times the size of Texas, but 70% of the industrial base is actually located between a triangle formed by Mexico City, Monterrey, and Guadalajara. So it's a very important area and region, and the easiest and quickest access to those points is actually Laredo, Texas. So the Laredo port is where most of the consumer products are crossing, along with automotive rail production, the rail as a predominant focus in that region, or that crossing point. So that being said about Laredo, Texas, El Paso is now the 14th largest port, and their business continues to increase. But that's a very different business. I mean, El Paso and Juarez are very much a manufacturing maquila focused border point. So the entries are almost always temporary entries, not consumption entries like you'd see over Laredo, Texas.
Yeah, no, interesting. When most people think about global trade and when they think about ports, right? Like you said, people tend to think of, Long Beach and kind of the West Coast ports, and kind of the gateways to Europe and Asia. But I hadn't really kind of realized the importance of Laredo, and kind of the amount of volume and business that gets transacted through there, as well as El Paso, as you noted. Um, so let's talk about kind of the transportation infrastructure, in Mexico. I mean, how would you characterize it? I mean, is it better or worse than what you would see, let's say, in some other developing, nations, such as in Asia?
Um, Yeah, I've had the fortune of traveling to a lot of different countries in Asia, Thailand, Vietnam. Recently, I was in Beijing. It is very different, and it's progressed very quickly. And I give most of the credit to Carlos Salinas, who was the president during the mid 90s. I think he was, although controversial as far as the figure is concerned, he also had a lot of foresight as far as what infrastructure would be required in Mexico in order to be the industrial nation that they wanted it to be. So he went out to private groups. And Adrian, can you still hear or see me? Okay, for some reason my screen went off, so I'm going to put it back on. I apologize. So the key with Salinas is he created a tremendous amount of investment in toll roads, the toll road system that basically allowed private entrepreneurs to manage the revenue stream of building roads for X amount of years. And those roads changed the dynamic of the country tremendously. Back in the day when I first came to the country, it was always said that you could not do business outside of Mexico City because all the decision makers were really in one place. And I know there were some exceptions to that in Monterrey and Guadalajara, but predominantly all of the major decisions for industry and a lot of the production was done in that area or around that area. Well, because of this increased infrastructure and road structure, you can now easily transit almost all points in all major cities within the country. They're first-class toll roads. They facilitate both passenger and truck traffic. They're very safe. They actually have green vehicles. They call the Angeles Verdes. They come and rescue you if your car breaks down. So the dynamic of moving cargo from point to point and allowing people to leave the urban centers of Mexico City and go to Querétaro, San Luis Potosí, Salao, and some of the other centers that are now becoming great industrial bases for the country has occurred. In addition, Salinas was the guy that came out and privatized the phone company. Now, some people say, the rumor is he may have sold it to himself. I mean, Carlos Slim, one of the richest guys in the world, now owns it. But again, he did a great job of linking the cities together and really changing the dynamics of the infrastructure within the country. And it is one of the, I would say, very, very modern in nature if you were to compare it to
Great. I'm gonna ask about some of the challenges that shippers need to be thinking about with regards to cross-border trade with Mexico. But I've got a question here from Ali Hiller. So I'm gonna go ahead and put it up on the screen. And the question is, what is the total annual amount of trade crossing from Mexico to the U.S.? I don't know if you've got that handy there.
I don't know if I have the exact statistics. I think I have prior statistics, and so the number that I had referred to prior, I believe this is correct. The U.S. imports from Mexico around 2 trillion. And again, that's the number I have referenced here. But I think more importantly, I'll talk to you about volume. So again, 14,000 trucks crossing a day, 12 to 14. About more than half of those are going northbound. In fact, I'm going to talk about the trade imbalance here in a minute. So I hope that helps answer some of the questions.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And he asked a follow-up question here, which I think is a good question too, in terms of looking at the different modes of transportation. So let me go ahead and put that up on the screen here. What percent of trade is moving via truck versus rail versus ocean, short sea from the Mexico to the U.S.?
That's a great question. So the predominant movement of freight is land transportation. It's about 80%. That's mainly truck transportation, although rail continues to take a larger and larger share. The other 20% is made up of predominantly ocean, some air freight. So the majority of trade taking place between the United States and Mexico. Not so much ocean, which would service Asia inbound, for example, to Mexico, or Europe inbound to Mexico. It is very, very much a land transportation market.
Great, thank you, Ellie, for the two great questions. So let's talk about kind of some of the logistics challenges that shippers have or should be aware of, with regards to cross-border trade with Mexico. What do you see as kind of the main challenges there?
But I think there are three major issues. I could go through a lot more, but three main topics I'd like to hit. There's a huge imbalance of freight during peak season. Peak season used to run about May to July 4th, more or less. That's changed actually this year. It started as early as April. There was a lot of capacity restraints. And what's happening, you have a mixture of agricultural season, you have automotive retooling during these periods, and it absorbs a lot of the northbound transportation capacity. So let's give an example. In normal market conditions, we may have one U.S. trailer coming from the United States into Mexico to a place like Monterrey or Guadalajara for every two shipments going northbound during regular seasons. Well, during these periods of time, there's so much export that those dynamics change from one southbound shipment to maybe three or four required for northbound. And it changes the dynamics of the market in a very important way. There's a lot more price competition. There's a lot more competition you may imagine for the equipment that's actually in the market. And there's a lot of strategies that need to be built around withstanding peak season currently in Mexico. I think it's going to get worse. I think we're going to continue to buy more. And Mexicans need to consume even more and more in order to create more balance. That's really the only solution. And the consumption cities right now tend to be more Mexico City, where there's a little bit more balance in trade than places like Monterrey and Guadalajara, where production is very high versus consumption. So that's one issue, again, imbalance of freight during peak season. There's a black hole at the border. That's another big topic for people. The old model used to be U.S. trucker, U.S. customs broker, crossing agent, Mexican customs broker, Mexican crossing agent. You may have warehouses in between, and all those parties are trying to figure out how to work together. And that's created a lot of issues and problems during the years. And I think that there is a trend towards integration for many, many reasons. But the biggest thing is just for the sanity of the client, trying to interact with all those different distinct parties in a very segmented type business model with very little interaction or handoff of information between all those parties creates a lot of difficulty for clients. So the black hole at the border is still an issue that can be overcome mainly through integration wherever possible. I always say to people, build in flexibility in Mexico. The only consistency I've ever seen over my 20 plus years in the Mexican marketplace is inconsistency. So every year it changes, dynamics of the market changes, balance of freight changes, exchange rates change, which drive certain dynamics into the market. So be smart. I mean, have backup customs brokers, have more than one carrier, have more, as I say to most people, have more than one bullet in your gun. Different ports as far as options. And contingency planning is key. I'll give a great example. The Monterey hurricane that occurred, I think, 4 or 5 years ago, basically shut down the main roadways and railways between Monterey and Laredo, Texas. And many clients had no flexibility as far as customs brokerage or carriers or other elements, and their freight sat. And there were installations that sat idle in the U.S. because they couldn't get parts. And there were retailers that ran out of stock of Mexican cargo, Mexican goods, and their agricultural products were affected in U.S. Markets and retailers. So be smart, think of diversity and contingency planning. I think that's a good way to approach the market.
All great points. You didn't talk about security, and certainly that's an area that you see a lot of headlines around with what's happening in Mexico. Is it as bad as kind of you reading the papers, or how are companies that are working with Mexican trading partners and logistics service providers? How are you managing security and those types of risks?
Well, I think there's a lot of misnomers. I think People see the news and we assume certain things. I think I have some opinions on things, and I'll try to express those the best I can. I think drug cartels sell drugs. And those are the ones that you're seeing on the news that are battling it back and forth, or were battling it back and forth several years ago. Cargo thieves steal cargo. Very seldomly are they the same elements. So again, the publicity we have seen on TV is about drug wars, not cargo theft. In over 20 years of doing business in Mexico, I have rarely encountered cargo theft issues. So I used to say I could count them on my fingers and toes, the amount of times that I've actually seen problems, but I think there's a more dynamic way to look at this. So from a very, very reliable source, I collected a statistic in 2012 because Mexico doesn't have very clear crime statistics. So this is a company that does security in and out of Mexico, a very reputable company. They said there were roughly 4,700 cargo thefts in Mexico over that given year. Now, again, if you look at the 14,000 crossings in Laredo alone, and you extrapolate that over the 4,700 cargo thefts, you're going to see that cargo theft is really a fraction of a percent, although it receives a lot of attention. So I think the real issue for Mexico is more in the function of the limited liability. So in a Carta de Porte, which is the Mexican equivalent of the bill of lading for the Mexican carrier, the carrier is only legally liable for 15 times Mexican minimum wage per ton or fraction of. So that causes a lot of heartache for companies in the U.S. that are used to going to their current U.S. carriers for $100, $150, $250,000 for the cargo liability. It doesn't exist in Mexico. The carrier is only responsible for carrying your freight unless you contracted them for insurance. And my recommendation to most parties is if you need or want insurance, use your global policy, leverage that, and that will leverage your risk and your exposures in Mexico.
Great, great insights and advice there. We're kind of running out of time here, so I've got a couple of more questions left. When you look at, when I talked to a lot of 3PLs, and I mentioned this earlier, cross-border services is one of the fastest growing segments of their business, and I assume it's the same for you as well. What types of services and capabilities are, companies looking for as it relates to cross-border with Mexico?
Well, I'm going to be brief. Everyone is looking for integrated providers with great technology to create visibility at the border. They want to eliminate the handoffs and have one-party accountability. Some, not all the 3PLs are in a great position to do this service. I think that's why they're growing quickly. I think most clients need to find someone that has a core competency in land, transportation, not so much air or ocean, as they look for solutions at the border. It's obviously it's a truck and rail business predominantly. So the other thing that's happening is that companies are driving their distribution networks closer and closer to the border. It just makes sense. 3PLs are in a great position to offer these services.
So I guess to wrap up, as you look forward now, let's say, 5 years ahead, what do you see? What's your outlook for U.S.-Mexico trade, moving forward? And what advice would you give, to companies that are looking to get started or to grow their cross-border activities?
Okay. Well, U.S. and Mexico trade will continue to grow at an increasing rate in the years to come, and more manufacturing will continue to move from Asia to Mexico. That's my prediction. This trend will not stop in the near future. The U.S. should be looking for ways to accelerate this trend, as a strong neighbor, in my opinion, is good for the U.S. in many, many ways. So in reference to the first-time importer, this is a whole new school versus traditional Asia imports. You need to be open-minded about the differences versus the Asia ocean inbound program. So the Mexican custom house broker plays a much bigger role than most would imagine, because they're point of comparison is a U.S. Customs broker. So get a great expert in your corner and listen to them. It will save you a lot of time, heartache, and ultimately money.
Great, thank you, Troy. And as always, with all the topics that we cover here in Talking Logistics, we're only able to kind of scratch the surface, but I think we hit upon a lot of great, topics related to U.S.-Mexico trade. So I want to thank you again for your time today to kind of share your perspective on what's going on in this part of the industry.
It's always a pleasure to speak with you, and thank you to the audience also.
Great, and I want to thank all of you who joined us today and participating in this conversation. If you are watching this program on demand and you do have a question or a comment for Troy, you can go to the website, talkinglogistics.com, find this episode, and post a comment or question there, and I'm sure Troy will be happy to follow up via that medium as well. So, again, thank you all for joining us today, and look forward to seeing you in a future episode of Talking Logistics. Have a great day.
Thank you.